Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. My name is Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is May 24th, 2021. For those of you that might be newer to our podcasts and to our broadcasts, webinars, this is a live question and answer. So any questions, any content can be created by you. Just submit questions or topics at any time. And Malia, who's moderating for me this evening, will pass those on to me when there's a space in the broadcast for me to address them. For those of you that don't know, all of these broadcasts then go on to the podcast app. So go to any podcast app and search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast. Subscribe, like us, rate us there, share there, and you can have all this content. I usually put it up sometime the mid-morning the next day. So with that, let's get into the live questions that we have and the ones that are left over from last time. Somebody writes, Brad, my son will be moving out and living 2 hours from my home in order to start university in September. He was at your program several years ago. One of the reasons we sent him to your program was for heavy cannabis use. He still uses, but made good progress in other ways. Lately, we found bottles of alcohol in the house. He says his substance use is not a problem. I've told him I hope he can recognize if substance abuse is or becomes a problem, and that he can take action if it becomes a problem. I'm there for him if he wants my help in any way. Is there anything more you'd suggest that I do? He's 19 and will be living 2 hours from me, so any minimal control I might have over his substance use will completely disappear when he leaves home. Thank you so very much. What a fantastic question that I think frames very well what is our work and what isn't our work. And so I'm going to start with the most general idea in this question. First and foremost, especially when it comes to something like substance use, it's really not our job to decide. I think you've done this well by the way that you framed your question. It's really not our job to figure out or to decide if substance abuse is a problem for our child. Right? We don't spend our energy trying to figure out, is our son or daughter or child an alcoholic, an addict? Is it become a problem for them? If it shows up in our life in a way that imposes on us, that takes away from us, that taxes us, that triggers us, that hurts us, then of course that's when it becomes our issue. And so I think what you want with somebody like this is you've communicated clearly. You've raised it as a question, and then you've put it back in his court, which I think is the right thing to do. Now, one might argue, and some people would support you. In fact, I have no opinion about this, but some people would argue or make the point that you could have a zero tolerance policy and get involved in testing and monitoring and checking up. But my experience is that kind of relationship with your child's substance use doesn't tend to be helpful, especially when they're an adult. You know, the younger they are, the more quote unquote control we want to exercise in the parenting relationship. And the older that they get, the more we kind of want to let them struggle and suffer from their own natural and logical consequences. I wish there was a way, and this is kind of what's implied in these types of questions. I wish there was a way to prevent suffering, to prevent setbacks, to prevent problems from cropping up and causing real damage to people's life. I really wish there was, but I don't think that there is. Again, younger and in your house, you can set rules and boundaries that would be different. But as they age out of, living at home, living with you, I think it's about just creating a safe place for them to check in with. What I try to say to the people in my life who have issues like this is to literally state it out loud explicitly. It's not my business. I'm not the one who decides or discovers if your substance abuse or your issues, your gambling, your whatever has become a problem. That's for you to figure out. My job is to be a resource to you if you need help, or if you want to bounce ideas off me or check ideas with me, that I can talk you through that thinking process, that discovery process. Years ago, I was attending conference on addictive disorders, and a similar question was asked of a panel where they were asked, "How do you know if substance use has become a problem?" And there are an infinite number of ways to kind of measure and think about substance use turning into a disorder, turning into an addiction. And as everybody in the audience, I'm sure does, I start thinking about what would my answer be to that question. It was posed as if it was coming from a parent, and my answer would be, I don't know, and you don't know, and it's not your job. Your job is to decide on your boundaries. When we set boundaries with somebody that's using or abusing substances in our lives, the goal isn't necessarily, ideally, the goal isn't to manage their substance use. By setting boundaries, that tends to have an effect on people, that they get to decide what's more important to me, my relationship with my spouse or alcohol, right? My freedom to drive a vehicle or alcohol, my health, my life, or alcohol. And you can substitute any drug in there. The legality, the risk. I used to say to our young people, if I had a gun that was a revolver and it had in it, let's say, 100 chambers, right? If it had empty spaces and spots for 100 bullets, and I just put one bullet in and I spun it so that I had no idea where that bullet was. And you came up to me and said, will you point this gun at your own head or at your children and pull the trigger? And if you do, I'll give you $1 million or $1 billion. My answer to the question would be that there's no number. There's no dollar figure that you could pay me that I would point a gun, if the chances were 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 or even 1 in 1,000,000, that it could go off and hurt somebody that I love. The point of my analogy is sometimes it's just the risk. Are we willing to take the risk? So to be clear to this question and to the rest of you, it's not your job really to diagnose your loved ones with an addictive disorder or not. We call it substance abuse disorder now, substance use disorder. But it really is your job to get clear about your boundaries, about what's your work, what's your side of the street, and to get clear about that. And even when or if you set boundaries as it relates to substance use, it's ideally not for the intended result to get them to stop or to manage. It's just to set up your life, and then they get to decide if the cost is too much to bear. So I think you have it clear. You've done what you need to do. And again, maybe most importantly, wouldn't it be nice? I always say this to parents, especially with young adult children or adult children. Wouldn't it be best if during a crisis they called you for support rather than a friend who might not have their best interests in mind, who might not have the insight and the experience that you have? But what that requires of you to be that first call is you have to be safe. If you get really attached to your agenda, to the diagnosis, then you're not going to be a safe place to call, a safe person to call. They're going to be expecting, and I told you so, to come out somewhere in the conversation, in tone, in word, or just symbolically come out in the conversation. So it's not a technique when I say, it's not a trick when I say you're not in charge of whether or not your child is an alcoholic or an addict or not. It's not really yours. It's not a technique or a trick. It's really a way of understanding what a healthy relationship is to a child. The last thing I'll say about this question, I've had many adolescents and adult clients in Wilderness over the years make the argument with me that they're not an addict and it's not a problem. And my response is, good, let's keep it that way. And therapy, the kind of therapy that we're doing, will give you the tools and the insight to recognize addiction when it's present. That's really what therapy is. It's giving you a sensitivity, an awareness an ability to see problems when they become problems. And I would even argue that not only does it give you that tool, but it makes you more discerning and sensitive to issues. Some people quit using when they have hangovers. Some people quit using when they say something hurtful to somebody that they love while they're under the influence. Other people, it might take a couple of DUIs or their spouse leaving them. We don't know. But therapy is ideally designed to raise the bottom, to not have to go all the way down to rock bottom. So I don't think you're missing anything. And again, like all of the work that we do at Evoke, do your work. Get clear on what's yours and what's not yours. Understand your relationship to yourself first, to your child, to your loved ones second, and then to their issues, right? What's my relationship to my child's substance use? Am I responsible for it? Is it my burden to bear? Did I cause it? Can I control it? Those are all very important processes, right? Questions that get answered as you do your work, as you work on your mental health issues and your boundaries. Somebody writes, I have a 15-year-old son who has been in therapeutic boarding school since January. He is doing well and moving up quickly in the levels. We recently hired an educational consultant who believes that the facility is not the right place for him. We, his parents, agree, which is why we hired her. However, she wants him to go to Wilderness now, then start at a new therapeutic boarding school. He had some hiccups at his home visit last week, so I know he is not ready to come home. My question is, does Wilderness have to be the start of recovery? Of course not. It doesn't have to be the start of recovery. But, you know, I know I'm in it. I know I represent and run a wilderness program, so it's impossible for me to have an objective, detached view of things. But wilderness therapy is just good therapy. It's away from screens. It's a healthy diet. It's being outdoors. It's naturally a great environment for mindfulness, exercise, small group communal living. I've said this many times, but NASA uses wilderness therapy for its astronaut teams if they've never worked together. I mean, think about that when thinking about this question. NASA, you can Google it when we're done or even while I'm talking. Google NASA, Harvard, like as in Harvard University, and wilderness therapy, and you'll read the research on it. They use wilderness therapy for perfectly healthy people, adults, because they find it's only in that context, or at least it's the most effective context that they found, where vulnerability and trust and real authentic relationship difficulties and issues are worked out. So when you think about wilderness therapy, I don't have an opinion about your child specifically, because I'm not your educational consultant. It's not my purview. But wilderness therapy is just good therapy. With all the backdrops or attributes that I just listed, you tack on top of it some of the best clinicians that work in this field, that work in this area, work with this population. And of course, I'm biased towards Evoke because we have an attachment-based model, which includes the parental work and the parental healing and the parental liberation from guilt and shame and blame and so forth and so on. So it's not like a punitive experience. It's not a punishment. It's not a setback. It's really just good therapy. So those are my thoughts about it. It's not necessary that he go back that way, but there must be something in with your child that the consultant sees as, I want to kind of get there. I want to get that piece built, that foundation built. Somebody writes, would it be better for my new child, or I suppose it just means my child, would it be better for my child to get a psychological evaluation now at about 1.5 weeks, or to wait until toward the end of their time at wilderness therapy, wondering if he'll be open and honest now, or if he needs more time in wilderness therapy before he'll be open and honest with a psych eval. Would having a psych eval be more helpful to help determine treatment and identify any unknown diagnoses, or better to wait? I know it's going to sound like I'm punting this question, but it's really, there's two answers generally, and then I'll talk about some principles. I think somewhere in between 1.5 weeks and the end of the program is about right. I like to see it at around week 4 or 5. First note to mention is that it takes a couple of weeks to set it up. So even if you set it up now, you still could plan it out for a couple of weeks from now. That middle phase where you're getting them to settle in more. You're not fighting some of the initial battles like you're talking about with honesty and self-disclosure, although they do tend to be very honest. And those tests can measure for somebody who's trying to fake good or fake bad. So if they're not being honest one way or the other, there are some aspects of the measurements that teach us about that. You want it not toward the end, because that's going to help with next steps. If your wilderness therapist, your child's wilderness therapist, is telling you that they need it earlier because they're so lost with the child and working with them that they need help to determine what's going on diagnostically, then that's a different variable. That's a variable that would lead me to do it earlier. But usually we're looking to kind of complete the circle, to understand learning differences, to kind of, it's not, the psychological evaluation doesn't stand alone. The psychological evaluation stands in conjunction with natural observation. That's what we provide as people, right? You marry the psych eval with the natural observation, and you get a more complete picture. And of course, there are some things which are invisible to the naked eye, like learning differences sometimes, like processing issues, like IQ, learning disabilities. So there are some, and then sometimes diagnostically, something in a psych eval will really shine a light on an area that was a little bit dark or fuzzy. So it's not I'm sorry, it's not a clear cut, and there is no answer, 1.5 weeks or week 7. In general, vaguely, I would say week 4 or 5. Planning ahead, of course. But specific to your child, your therapist or consultant might have a different opinion. And I generally didn't use, I would say probably about 10 to maybe 20% of the time, I needed it to be able to see what was going on because something was missing from the picture. But more often than not, it just augmented and added to what I was already seeing, and added some of the smaller brushstrokes so that going forward, after Evoke, whatever happens next, they would have a clearer picture, and it would even determine the type of setting or the specific setting. So that's kind of a combination of many answers, I suppose. Someone writes this question: how much does the child get involved when it comes to deciding the next step? I know the decision is ultimately up to the parents, especially if the said child is less than 18. But is there benefit to at least having the child voice what they think is important to consider the next phase of treatment? My answer is always. I always want to know what a child thinks. And just like you said, I think you have the right perspective. You run that through the parent filter, right? The adult filter. You use the professionals that you're working with to help you make sense out of that. The only mistake in asking an adolescent what they prefer is if you were to take their answer at face value and grant it equal weight to your decision, to your thinking, and to the professionals. But what they tell me about what they need or want next tells me about where they're at. And I will tell you this in general. The more evolved a child is, the healthier they are, the farther they are along on the mental health continuum, the less rigid, right? The less extreme will be their answers. In other words, people that are less evolved, less further along, will say things like, I have to have this, or I need this, or if I don't have this, I can't succeed, or I won't succeed, or I'll shut down, or I'll never forgive my parents. Kids farther along, higher on that measure of mental health and kind of psychological evolution, it sounds more like, I would prefer this, but I think I might need this, or I don't even know everything that I need. My best thinking got me here, so I'm open. The more that somebody has surrendered, which is to say that the more that they've become humble and teachable, honest with themselves, open, aware, the less rigid and dogmatic they'll get about their opinions. So even that assessment is important. Sometimes I would ask my adolescent students to write down a needs and a wants list, and we would take it. But I must say this, because this is consistently in the equation as parents make the decision. I want you to be very clear that if in your question there is some bit of, if I do it this way, they'll accept and invest in it and like it more, I want to warn you about that. In my opinion, in my experience, the number one greatest contribution you can make to your child making peace with where they're at is your ability to let them think and feel any way they want to about it. Don't sell it to them. Don't try to trick them into liking it. To use a very simple analogy, my wife practices this all the time. When recommending a movie or a television series, she undersells it. And I think anyone can relate to when you really look forward to a movie, when you have high expectations. It's very easy to get disappointed. And the greatest predictor of satisfaction, of marital satisfaction, for example, is related to expectations going into the marriage. So when you write and talk about it with your child, don't sell it. Say, you're probably going to hate some of it. Here's why I like it. Or here's something you might like. And you're probably not going to like the rules and the dress code. You know, you're probably not going to like the limited access to music or whatever it is. That is and then genuinely lean into allowing the child to feel disappointed, angry, frustrated, sad, grief, letting them feel what they feel with regard to the final decision is the most important variable that will determine whether or not that you have control over, that will lead to them settling in, finding peace, and eventually even some investment. Somebody writes, I have a child who has substance abuse issues. Realistically, how much impact can 3 months in wilderness have on someone struggling with this issue? Do you have statistics on this topic? Well, we've done more research than any other wilderness program in the history of wilderness therapy, I'm proud to say. So if you go to our website, and maybe Malia, you can post some links there. We have results from the general field of wilderness therapy, and also that has been done by us and our therapists at Evoke. And so we have all kinds of data about that. Absolutely. My answer is it can change their life. My son's 28 and he still refers to his wilderness experience at 13. He turned 14 in the wilderness. That's 14 and a half years ago. And there are still life lessons that he applies to his life every day. You know, everybody's different. And a lot of the seeds that get planted, the lessons that get taught, the lessons that they're exposed to can go dormant for a while. But even myself, I was sent to a treatment center when I was a teenager. And I could list you 10 things that I still think about in my daily life. So somebody writes, what does Evoke do when it gets cold at night? For my native California kids, 60 degrees can be cold. What about when it gets really cold, like 45 degrees or even 25 degrees? I think that's funny because I'm a California kid. I grew up in Southern California. And when I first started in wilderness therapy in Utah, I was shocked. But the first thing I learned about kids is that they're more resilient than you think. First of all, we have all the gear that they need. We have actually wall tents with stoves if it gets cold in the wintertime. But most of the time, you might not be surprised to hear that most of the times we have to tell them to put on a jacket. I remember I had a mother visit from Southern California, from Malibu, California, many years ago. And she was complaining about her son, about how cold it was, and she was worried about her son. She was out in the field. And then I pointed out the next day that he wasn't wearing his jacket, his winter jacket that we provided for him. And so resiliency is something that wilderness therapy absolutely underscores, emphasizes, facilitates, improves upon. And you'll be surprised, even from a California kid, of anybody you've met as an adult. I love the California weather more than anybody else that I've met. But you kind of learn to adjust, and it becomes a metaphor for, I guess, dealing with the weather of life, that there are going to be storms and cold fronts, and I won't belabor the metaphor, but they do okay. Somebody writes, my 19-year-old is home from college for the summer, not really by choice, but by default because he wasn't able or motivated to make other plans. He has been home for a week, lying around, and is not communicating any plans for a job. Volunteering, home study, outdoor adventure programs, therapy. We have talked about how it doesn't feel great to lay around, and I've asked him to find some way that's meaningful to spend his time. Were it not for my 16-year-old former Evoke student coming home from a residential treatment center on Wednesday, I would let this play out with my older son, trusting he'll eventually find some motivation, but feeling anxious about having our expectations for our 16-year-old feel very unfair when he sees his older brother lay around. After premature empty nesting for over a year, we will have 3 at home as of this Wednesday. Any advice? Well, you covered the gamut. I don't think there's a lot of value in trying to create fairness. I really don't. I mean, children will. This is a really fundamental principle. Children will accuse you of being whatever you don't want to be, to try to get you to do what they want you to do. And that's why it's so important to do your own work, so that there's some distance psychologically between what they think about you and what you think about you, how accessible and vulnerable your buttons are, so to speak. So that's the first principle. If you value kindness, they'll call you unkind. If you value fairness, they'll call you unfair. It's just the way that it works. It's actually common sense. If it doesn't work to call you that, why will they keep calling you that? So that's the first thing. Know what your buttons, what your weak spots, what your vulnerabilities, what your insecurities are. Know yourself well enough. So much of the work with parenting that we do is to try to build a base of self-knowledge so that you're less susceptible to the winds and to the accusations and to the threats. Okay. And I don't have much of a better answer beyond that, meaning that you can just set your boundary with your adult. You're allowed to set boundaries with your adult. You're allowed to say, to live here, here's the rules. Now, are you willing to escalate it if he or she refuses and kick them out? That's up to you. Obviously, and I've said this to parents in the last week and a half, obviously there is a line in the sand that every child could cross that would lead you to saying to your adult child, you can't live here anymore. And everybody can imagine that. Where you draw that line is completely up to you. And I'll tell you teach one more principle as it relates to this question. I shared it a couple of weeks ago, but I'll retell it in the context of this question. I was working with a parent recently who was having a similar issue with somebody in their life. And they said to me, I just need to practice more patience. I need to develop more compassion, to develop more understanding. Maybe I need to meditate more or do yoga, or maybe I need to double up on my therapy, go to more meetings, whatever it is. And I said to this person, I said, that's great, but understand this. And this is the shiniest nugget of the evening so far. The outcome of your increased enlightenment may be that you kick the child out of the house. Now, I'm not saying it will be by any means, but I think sometimes some of us, certain personalities, are inclined to think this way, that we just have to keep getting more and more and more patient. Increased awareness and enlightenment and mental health will also result in clearer boundaries with people at times. It might result in a divorce, for example, or sending a child to a program, or not letting a young adult child live with you. Again, I'm not saying, I want to be as clear as I can. I'm not saying it will. I'm not even saying it will in most cases. I'm just saying it's an option. And I want you to know that it's an option. It is one of the outcomes of increased mental health capacity. And why I make this point so emphatically is because I want you to know that you have choice, and that you're not wrong or bad if you do it one way or the other, and that nobody, including me, knows. In a lot of ways, I've learned to shift my language from I do it until I can't. The new book I'm working on right now has the working title about the working title is Stay in the Room. And my publisher, when I was presenting it to her, said, she said to me, is it okay to leave the room? And I thought, that's a really good question. Maybe even such a good question that we want to change the title. Because absolutely, one of the outcomes of growth is to leave the room. Someone writes, our son is 15 and has recently started at Evoke with Mikey Means group. Should we try to avoid bringing up things he tells Mikey in confidence in our letters to him? For example, he called me, his mom, a control freak. I wrote back this week saying I will work on that, and even made it a joke. Is that okay? Yeah, I would prefer that you communicate in such a way that your son knows that you and Mikey are openly communicating. Our therapists at Evoke, when they tell you things, unless they specifically tell you to keep it between you and them, which is the exception to the rule by far, let them know that you're having an open dialogue. Absolutely. We want you to be informed and to write from that informed place. And making a comment, by the way, I love making a joke about it. Making a joke about it is most likely a sign that it's not as bad as it could be, right? Mental health, one of the indicators of mental health is the ability to laugh at yourself, to not take yourself too seriously. For example, borderline personalities and narcissistic personalities. I'm not talking about the disorder. I'm talking about traits. Humor at the expense of oneself is a humiliating experience. But the healthy and the enlightened ones, that are able to make light of themselves and talk about it. Now, again, if your child experiences that joke is dismissive or not taking them seriously, then you can apologize. But in general, that's an excellent, healthy response. Somebody writes, are you familiar with Dr. Daniel Amen and the Amen Clinic? Vaguely. Do you find validity in the SPECT brain scans completed at the Amen Clinic? I can't really comment on it too much. I just don't have enough knowledge about it. Any information would be helpful to consider. But it would be an uneducated response for me to make any other comments on it. I do trust the work that neurologists and our imaging is providing for us around neurological functioning. I think we're going to learn stuff in the next 15 or 20 years where we'll be able to, it'll be like science fiction. We'll be able to see depression and anxiety. We'll be able to see mental health through some of our imaging processes. So I don't know enough about the SPECT brain scans to comment on them specifically, but yes, in general, imaging is becoming very helpful. Like I said with the psychological testing earlier, I can only imagine that it adds to completing the circle. Somebody writes, I feel that I am not enough for my son. He is very smart, very sensitive, and I have so many defects. He's coming home from a therapeutic boarding school, and I want to stay far from him as much as I can, doing my work and focusing on myself. I mean, there's something in what you're saying that's very, very wise, and there's something in it that I'm a little bit concerned about. I mean, that sounds a little bit dramatic, but what I mean is, you're not toxic waste, right? I talk all the time about recognizing and understanding how we dent and bruise our children, but we also are more than that. We love them more than others. The fact that you're willing to do your work is a great gift. You know, there's a sense of getting out of the way, of do no harm, that I like in your question. And there's a tone in it that I worry a little bit that you're being overly punishing of yourself, overly judgmental. So continue to do your work. You've accomplished something that many people struggle with severely, which is looking at how they dent and bruise their children. So you've accomplished that. But maybe just getting some support and finding a nurturing therapist and a support group that can help you to embrace the idea of good enough parenting. But again, I'll also say, you know, it's possible that you're toxic. I've had parents that have shared with me the way that they've treated their children, and I've agreed with them, with their own assessment, that they've been really toxic with their children. That's possible. Somebody writes, on the topic of psych evals, my son had one in the wilderness last summer, and in the throes of it, of being pretty unwell. A year and 2 wilderness and 2 residential programs later, he is doing well, assuming he will move on to the next step sometime next winter. At what point does it become useful to do another psych eval? You know, I don't know if he's doing well and progressing. You need another one. I think there's a consideration around intrusion. There's a consideration around over labeling, right? They can enter into it, so it's difficult to say. If you don't have any questions and he's making progress, I wouldn't be inclined to suggest it necessarily. So that's my thought about it. If you have unanswered questions or there seems to be some stalling or some setbacks that are significant, then asking questions and getting them answered with another psych eval at this point, given the time frame that you're describing, it could be helpful. But not just because enough time has passed. Somebody writes, how do you prepare them that most of the students at Evoke won't be going home right after? I can't imagine having that conversation with our son who just started. Well, the good news is he's having it with other people, okay? Naturally, this conversation happens in the wilderness. It was for me, and I'll say this as straightforwardly as I can, it was for me the most shocking part of working in a wilderness therapy program, the not going home afterwards. It was difficult to imagine. It was overwhelming to empathize with the idea at 13, 14, 15, 17, 18 of going somewhere else for another year. When I put myself in that position, I couldn't imagine it. But like I started to say earlier, and I don't think I finished the thought, the very first thing I learned about wilderness therapy was that the staff are amazing people. But the second thing I learned in wilderness therapy. And it was the first thing that I learned about the clients, the students, the young people, is that they're much more resilient than they or their parents thought they were. So they can handle difficult things. And of course, now 25 years later, it's a fairly easy discussion to have relative to those early days. And although I have the utmost empathy for the feelings that come up when a child hears that boundary stated to them and then finalized by the parents, they can adjust and they can move from, acceptance and resignation to investment and even appreciating it. And I'll just, as an aside, life is hard. Being a human is hard. It's also a joyous thing, but it's difficult. And being a parent, a human parent, raising human children, that's really, really hard to do. So we just kind of walk each other home, right? We offer our presence. We can't make the world a perfect place. We can't take away somebody's grief if they've lost somebody that they love, or if they're struggling with depression or anxiety. We might not be able to take it away. But what we can do is we can be with them. We can offer our presence. And we can learn, as I say, we can learn to sit with others in their unsolvable problems. And I think that's ultimately the gift that we offer. And we can only do that when we learn to be present in our discomfort, in our pain, in our sadness. When we learn to be present and embrace what I refer to as our empathic misery, which means the pain that comes from sitting with somebody that we care about who's suffering. And ultimately, we teach them how to feel. That's kind of a simple way to think about therapy and think about wilderness therapy. We're teaching your children how to feel, which is an imperfect, messy, human process. Somebody writes, my 22-year-old son has been struggling with depression and anxiety for many years. For several months now, I have been thinking that a life-threatening illness and hospitalization at 10 months of age may have traumatized him to such an extent that it may be a significant factor in his mental health struggles. I'm reluctant to discuss this with his mother, my ex, as I feel it will be a very difficult conversation and open old wounds. Any advice on how I approach this with her? I think you can hold it lightly. And if she rejects it, or she's not ready to look at it, or it's triggering for her, for whatever reason, drop it. You see, folks, as a father, as a husband, as a therapist is where I learned it first. It's never the first mistake that's the bad mistake, that's the big mistake. It's never when we say to a client or to a child, how about this idea? Or what about this? That's not the big wound. That's not the big error. That's not the big mistake. The big mistake, and I see it over and over again, is when you defend it, when you attach yourself to it, when you hold on to it tightly, when you try to go back and prove it, when you debate, when you argue. I teach this to our therapists all the time. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to offer ideas. You're going to offer insights, tools, suggestions, reflections to your clients, to the parents, to people in your practice. And you're not going to get it right all the time. And they're not going to be ready for it. Times when you might be, quote unquote, right. The skill, the magic is dropping it when they push back against it. So I would offer that to you. Somebody writes, our son has just turned 15 and is 2.5 weeks into Evoke. He has completed the 8th grade and is enrolled in freshman year in August. Are there any trends in this period of time between 8th and 9th grade for the success of the program? I don't know that we've I don't know that we've separated it out in that age group specifically. You can look at our again, Malia, you can post the link to the research on our website, but I don't know that we've separated it out for that age group in general. I will say middle school to me is the most challenging time. Right? Emerging adolescence is the most challenging, trying time for a lot of kids. Identity, insecurity, hormones, neurodevelopment is moving along quite rapidly at that pace. It's just a difficult set of adjustments. Very difficult. Somebody writes, is it possible for someone in wilderness treatment to be in wilderness treatment for too long? This may happen when there are complications enrolling the client at the next treatment center. In other words, can wilderness therapy reach a point where there are diminishing returns? I think so, for sure. And, you know, if there are complications regarding the next treatment center, that's just, you know, that's, I don't mean this in a dismissive way, but that is life. You know, it's like asking the question, when is it a good time to lose a parent? Right? You wouldn't think that losing a parent when you are under the age of 10 is good, or between 10 and 20 is good, or you'd like to have a parent around while you're a young adult, and you could, you know, but eventually it's going to be, number one, stuff happens. And again, not to be dismissive, this is not something I would ever want you to repeat to your child. But not everything is going to go their way. And what we're teaching your children is, we're not fishing for them and giving them the biggest, juiciest fish. We're teaching them how to fish. And I say this to clients and parents all the time. For most of your children, not all of them, but for most of your children, the most painful things haven't happened to them yet. Even this question earlier about the hospital experience and the trauma that it may have caused. For most people, at the age that they come to our program, the worst things in their life haven't happened yet. For some of them, it has, and that's sad. That's horrible. But therapy is not about me giving you the answers. Therapy is about me creating a process where you learn to discover the answers that you have. I wrote this the other day. In fact, I wrote this on my social media the other day, and I'll pull it up right now. I'll read it to you. It says, it's often said, quote, life doesn't come with a manual, unquote. But life does come with a manual. Parenting has a manual. Marriage has a manual. There's a manual for all of it. It is inside of us. Therapy is a process of discovering the answers we have inside of us. When we look deeply inward and explore our inner landscape, this awareness becomes a map for navigating our outside life and relationships. In other words, all the most important wisdom I have is from understanding this, me. Like the Oracle at Delphi says, know thyself first, right? Self-knowledge is the most, in my experience, the most useful kind of knowledge that there is in the world, because it's in there that we understand what it means to be a human. And then we know how to see other humans. We know the dark parts, the light parts, the shameful parts, the guilty parts, the enlightened parts, the smart parts, the stupid parts, right? The more parts you discover, and essentially everybody has all of them to a greater or lesser extent, the more we understand other people. So for your child, the process is about them figuring out how to deal with the circumstances if they have to stay here a little longer. We don't do it to them. We don't keep them extra long just because. But if it happens because of circumstances, that will feel a lot like life to them. Somebody writes, my 18-year-old son is now 19 months sober, and our life looks so much better than it did 2 years ago. However, even with all the work I'm doing, I find myself expecting more from him, and I know that has nothing to do with him, and it says everything about me. I just don't understand why I struggle with this. Does it ever get to a point where I will be able to accept him for who he is without having to be consciously aware of not putting my stuff onto him? Bit by bit, piece by piece, one small step at a time. And first and foremost, I think I shared this with you all recently. I was doing some training with somebody not too long ago, and I was talking about, I think I was talking about codependency. And the person that I was talking to that I work with said, but I don't want to be codependent. And I said, you don't get that choice now, today. The first step is to observe what you are, to lean into it, to talk about it, to name it, to make it explicit. I said this to children in the wilderness. I say this to children in the wilderness all of the time. I say there's a step between struggling with issues and being cured, for lack of a better word. And that's where most of the work lies. And besides, we never arrive anyway. Arriving is death. Arriving is a disaster. And so the more work we do, and the more work you do, the more you'll realize how flawed you are, how human you are. So my thought is embrace it, like look at it, let it teach you, understand it, develop compassion for yourself. Be with a therapist who says things to you on a regular basis, things like that make sense. Let's talk about where you learned that. This stuff is hard to unlearn, hard to repair. It's really, really difficult. And spending some time in the thick of it is really, really important, because in the end, enlightenment isn't being perfect. In the end, enlightenment is learning to have compassion for your fallibility, for your humanness. Because when we have compassion and non-judgment for ourselves, we don't act it out on others. I say this all the time. The subtitle of my most recent book is Learning to Love the Horrible, Rotten Self. If you learn to love your horrible, rotten self, which is to say learning to kind of carry it around and be responsible for it, to own it, then you won't hurt other people as much. If you don't learn to own it, you'll hurt other people a lot more. Let's see, I think I might have another quote that I pulled up from social media on this. Let's see if I can find it. Oh, I can't find it right now. All right, looks like that's all the questions for today. Upcoming events, announcements. Both my books are available on Amazon.com and on Audible, and I did the voice of I did the reading for the new one. The Audacity to Be You and the Journey of the Heroic Parent is also available there. If you want to do a deep dive into your own work, attending our Finding You intensives is a great place to start. Just contact intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information, or to speak with an admissions or an enrollment specialist there. We also have an online option that's a little bit less expensive and also less demanding of your time. So that's an option. If you want to do a pursuits program for yourself or for your family, these are adventure recreational programs for adults and families. Think Therapy Light or Sober Fun. Those are available. Just contact Sarah without the H, Sarah@evoketherapy.com. We have online support groups for wilderness, current, and alumni families. The next one is May 27th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, or for intensive alumni participants, it's June 8th at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Contact Malia@evoketherapy.com for more information. You can follow us on social media. All of our broadcasts are available on the podcast app. Sometime typically the next day. Just go to any podcast app and search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast. Subscribe, like, rate us there, share. You can also go to soundcloud.com on your computer and search Finding You, an Evoke Therapy podcast. Just listen to it from your computer. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram at using the handle @Evoke Therapy, or on Instagram using the handle @Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching either Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And of course, we have a blog with new content each week that Malia does a great job of managing. Our next broadcast will be June 1st at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. I'll be talking about the final chapter from my book, How to Get the Support You Need, Chapter 10, from the Journey of the Heroic Parent. And then on the 2nd, I'll have a live Q&A the next day. I'll be heading out to the field at our Cascades location for the next couple of days, so won't be able to broadcast. Have a great week, folks. It's nice to connect with you again. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Thank you on behalf of the people that love you for your willingness to do your work and to learn and to grow. Take care, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.